the information vacuum in China now, it's impossible to know whether or not there's going to be an attack because Xi doesn't talk with anyone. There's no one's phone you can bug to find out what he's thinking. Also, if the Chinese were to make a move on Taiwan, even if they capture it in a matter of 6 weeks without a shot fired, they don't know how to operate those semiconductor facilities because they can't operate their own. They use imported labor to do all of the quality checks on all of the wafers. And the ones in Taiwan are the world's most advanced. The ones in China are very much the other side. So if they got them, they would just be big paperweights, and obviously that would remove semiconductors for the rest of us, but it wouldn't really help them technologically. And it would trigger, among other things, the United States to act militarily. And it's not like we would confront the Chinese in the South China Sea or anything. We'd probably just put a couple destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and cut the energy flow and cut the ability of them to import the things they need to grow their own food. So China would be facing a national collapse within a couple of years if they do pull the trigger on Taiwan. Normally, I would say that this would mean that they wouldn't even consider it. But again, Xi is now in an information black box, and we can't rule it out. All I can tell you for sure is that one way or another, some country involved in the supply chain somewhere is going to crack. I'm actually more concerned about Germany than I am about Taiwan, but it would have the same impact. The Germans specifically make the lenses that allow all of the lithography to happen. No lenses, no lithography, no chips. The hope, because people seem to like me to say things that are hopeful, is that there is a new lithography technology that is coming out that has fewer parts and doesn't require neon, which we're dependent on the Russians and the Chinese for, that might have a simpler supply chain. But if we ironed out all the kinks of that today, it's not going to be applied at scale in Taiwan within 3 years. So there are potentially ways forward here, but I find it unlikely that we're going to be able to avoid a disruption in that specific market. It's too vulnerable to too many things. All world leaders, democratic or otherwise, have problems with narcissism and ego. We're not immune to that. The question is how honest you are about your own capacity. So Putin has also established a bit of a cult of personality and has also purged the system of people who might rise up to replace him. But he started from a much lower base, which has shaped how much he's willing to carve out. So at the end of the Cold War, let me go back, 1983, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And the intelligence services took over, purged all the other factions from the Communist Party. This is the Andropov coup. And Andropov, Chernomyrdin, and Gorbachev, they were the first three, ran the country until the end. Putin is part of that clique, and the intelligence professionals took over after the fall and have run it until now. And Putin has bit by bit removed people who he thought was threatening, and he hasn't done a lot to bring up a new generation from below. So Putin's inner circle today is less than 10 people, half of whom are utterly incompetent. If you ever see anything by Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, he's the most incompetent of them. You can ignore whatever he says. But there are a few of them that actually do provide him with advice and context. So I think the best example I can give you is if you go back to the January before the war, the March, and the words. March, just after the war began, when Putin was making all the nuclear threats, the US ambassador was dispatched, and the message was something like this, like, Mr. President, just think of things from a little different angle here. You remember back in January when you decided and you gave the order for the day the war was going to start, and you were in the bunker under the Kremlin that was completely sealed. It was walk-in safe, no electronics, no notes. And an hour after you left that meeting, we published the notes of the meeting in the media. That was our way of telling you that we know where your person is at any given moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen we send back are going to go anywhere except straight up, you're out of your mind. So stop it. The point is that Putin has meetings. He has people, he's discussed things, which means you can hack into the fax system and the email, you can tap the phones, there's ways to learn. And as bad as the demographic situation is in Russia, there's still a massive producer and exporter of food and energy, whereas China now has no inner circle, no communication, no way to find out anything, and are the world's largest importer of pretty much everything that keeps people alive. So in the worst case scenario for the Russians, they will still persist longer than in the best case scenario for the Chinese. China's almost over. The Russians have at least another decade and a half to 2 decades. But this is still probably the last generation of Russian leadership. And forced labor is going to be some of our least of our concerns when it comes to human rights issues. So I would expect those supply chains to wither for independent reasons. Second, business community, swing voters. One of the things that people missed about Governor DeSantis of Florida is that he hasn't gone to war with Disney. He's gone to war with the Florida business community. ESG, is it doing a good job? Questionable. Is it taking us to where we need to go? I don't know. But since the business community is no longer part of the conversation, they are trying to figure out where they fit into American society. ESG is a component of that. It's an internal conversation. And so every business is approaching this from their own way, based on their own circumstances, their own geography, their own politics, their own workforce. And of course, they're all coming up with different conclusions, some of which are, But when people on the left or the right yell at business about ESG, business just gets pissed off because they're doing the best they can when they're not allowed in the room. So when I hear people like Ramaswamy or DeSantis screaming about ESG, it's like all you are doing is making it easier for the business community to never support the Republican Party again. So there are consequences, and we're going to see them in the presidential and the general election next year, but they're going to be unpredictable in a way that we're not used to seeing out of that community. We're used to the business community being the adults in the room. Now, more specifically to your question about child labor, since there are no standards in ESG, since every company comes at it from their own angle for their own reasons, there is no pattern, in my opinion. So we're going to be waiting to see what happens in terms of international capacity to build this stuff. And those countries are not going to snap in a neat order or all at once. So I hate to say this, this is a tier 3 supplier issue. And there is not going to be a database that allows us to map this on its way down. Americans are very good at brain work. We have the highest value-added designers in the world. The Mexicans are great at production. They're the highest value-added manufacturers in the world. But if you were to increase the cost of labor in Mexico by a factor of 5, they'd probably give us a run for our money. It's not an issue of us or them being smarter or dumber than the other one. They're at a different stage of their economic cycles and their growth, and we have different infrastructures to work with. So I've never seen a study that looks at race from an IQ point of view that has ever held up. Every time I've ever seen it, they've kind of thrown it out. It's at best noise, but that doesn't mean we're all in the same place. So one of the things about January 6th is it happened just after an election, so its effects haven't been fully felt in terms of who votes for who. But when we got to the midterms, despite expecting a red wave, we had a red burp in the House and a red loss in the Senate. And what we found out is that the independents in the United States had changed considerably. Couple things. Number one, Trump has basically told independents that the general election doesn't matter, which means that the independents don't matter, and because the general election is the only place that the independents have a voice. And so they reacted to that. In exit polling, something crazy, like 85% of independents said that they despised the White House's economic policies and felt that they hurt independents more than anyone else. And independents are fickle. They almost always switch sides every election. They get buyer's remorse. And in the time before, they had voted for Biden. And now they were clearly fed up with him, but almost all of them voted for Democrats anyway. There's a saying in the State Department in the Middle East, that we support one person, one vote, but not just one time. And if the independents were going to show up in numbers to vote against their own personal economic best interests in order to make sure they could vote again in an off year, you can bet they're going to do so in the general. Trump will probably carry no more than 12 states. And then the Republican Party is going to have to decide what to do with that. And the people who are, oh no, I broke it. The people who are here, the rhinos, are going to have to decide if they want to try to wait it out, which hasn't worked yet, or move on. And we'll know within 2 years.